This is it. Maximum acceleration. Fire control, target the flagship. Launch all drones. Hey, Captain. Firing now.
Aliens thought humans were prey. They were wrong. The Kryx Ascendancy had annexed 41 star systems in 300 years without ever losing a fleet action. And High Speaker Kaelthorn Vex intended to add a 42nd to that record with the same unhurried confidence. A butcher brings to livestock that has already been led into the pen. He stood on the observation deck of the dreadnought vessel of righteous correction, watching through 11 meters of transparent armor as 600 warships of the Kryx Second Ascendant Fleet spread themselves across the dark like a slow bloom of iron flowers. Their hulls the deep burnished bronze the Kryx favored for ships that expected to win with dignity rather than desperation. Their weapon batteries gleaming with the particular polish of a species that had never needed to fire them in genuine fear. Behind that fleet lay 3 centuries of conquest so total, so unbroken that Kryx war doctrine had calcified into something closer to religious ceremony than tactics. Honorable engagement, declared intentions, formal challenge before battle, mercy extended to any enemy commander who recognized, in time, the mathematics of his own inevitable defeat. It was a doctrine built by a species that had simply never met an enemy willing to burn that mathematics to ash and fight anyway. The vessel of righteous correction herself embodied that unbroken confidence in every line of her 3-kilometer hull. Bronze-plated ablative armor layered across a spine of reinforced ceramite, weapons batteries arranged in the formal, symmetrical patterns Kryx shipwrights had used with only cosmetic variation for the better part of 3 centuries. Because a doctrine that had never once required innovation had never once been forced to consider it. Her escort screen of dreadnoughts and battlecruisers moved in the same rigid ceremonial formation the Ascendancy had used to accept the surrender of 41 previous species. A formation built not for tactical flexibility, but for the specific psychological weight of visible, undisguised, overwhelming force. The honest presentation of strength that Kryx honor codes considered the only acceptable prelude to conquest. It had never once occurred to any Ascendancy shipwright, in 300 years of building fleets meant to be seen and feared rather than concealed and survived, that an enemy might simply decline to fight the kind of war those ships had been built for. Human space lay 4 days burn ahead of the fleet's current position. A modest cluster of 40-some systems the Kryx Ascendancy's own scouting reports described, without particular alarm, as technologically adequate, doctrinally rigid, numerically insufficient. 200 human warships against 600 Kryx vessels of superior armor, superior shielding, and weapons batteries that could shear through human hull plating the way a hot blade parts old rope. Kaelthorn had read the assessment twice during the transit, mostly out of the professional thoroughness that had carried him through 11 previous campaigns, and found nothing in it to disturb the settled certainty with which he approached every conquest. Humans would fight bravely, humans would fight honestly, humans would lose exactly as every other species the Ascendancy had ever met had lost. And in some appropriate span of months, the Kryx would add human labor and human resources to the vast, orderly machinery of the Ascendancy's expansion. And history would record it as engagement number 42, unremarkable among its predecessors. He did not yet understand, and would not fully understand until it was far too late to matter, that he was not fighting a species that intended to lose honorably. He was fighting a species that had already decided, at the highest levels of its surviving command structure, that it would rather burn its own colonies to cinders with its own hands than hand them over intact to an invader, that it would fly its own obsolete warships into the heart of an enemy fleet as nothing more than very expensive, very fast chunks of metal, that it would seed its own asteroid fields with enough hidden fission yield to sterilize a star system, rather than let that system's resources feed a war machine grinding toward Earth. He was fighting, in short, a species run by people willing to do the mathematically brutal things that 11,000 years, 300 years, in the Kryx's own reckoning of honorable warfare had never once required the Ascendancy to consider. Admiral Sarah Voss commanded the Sol defense fleet from the cramped, unglamorous flag bridge of the heavy cruiser Iron Harvest, a ship 40 years old, patched and repatched across 3 previous conflicts, her hull scarred with the pitted evidence of meteor strikes and old battle damage that no shipyard had ever bothered to fully cosmetically repair, because there had never been budget or time for anything but keeping her structurally so. Uned and combat-capable, Voss herself was 51 years old, gray-haired, narrow-shouldered, with the kind of flat, unblinking stare that junior officers learned within their first week not to mistake for coldness, because it was not coldness at all. It was simply the particular quality of a person who had done the arithmetic of total war down to its final, ugly decimal, and had made peace years ago with every horrifying implication of that arithmetic. The Iron Harvest herself was, in her own grim way, as much a monument to the war humanity was fighting as the vessel of righteous correction was to the war the Kryx believed they were fighting. Her corridors ran narrow and low-ceilinged, patched in a dozen different shades of hull plate salvaged from 3 previous decommissioned vessels. Her life support cycling air that carried, permanently, the faint metallic tang of scrubbers running years past their rated service life. Condensation beaded along exposed conduit in the colder compartments near her outer hull, and in the enlisted berths, 4 decks below the flag bridge, sailors slept in shifts in bunks stacked 3 high, breathing recycled atmosphere that never quite lost the smell of the ship's long and difficult service history. There was no dignity in her, none of the ceremonial polish the Kryx lavished on vessels built to be feared on sight. She was a working ship crewed by people who had long since stopped expecting the war to be fought on any terms except the ones that kept them alive one more day, and Voss had chosen her as a flagship, over half a dozen newer and more comfortable vessels, precisely because she never let anyone aboard forget, for even a moment, exactly what kind of war they were in. 200 hulls against 600, said her chief of staff, Captain Devon Auconquorais, reading the final consolidated tactical estimate off his tablet in the flag bridge's dim red combat lighting. Their tonnage advantage alone is better than 3-1, Admiral, and that's before you factor shielding and beam output. Fleet intelligence puts Kryx point defense and armor a full technological generation past anything we're fielding. If this were a straight fleet engagement, conventional doctrine, line against line. It's not going to be a straight fleet engagement, Voss said, not looking up from the star chart glowing on the plot table between them. A chart marked with red overlays across 7 human systems, 17 colonies, and a dozen asteroid fields that her staff had spent the last 18 months quietly, methodically, and at horrific human cost turning into something the Kryx Ascendancy's honorable formal. 300-year unbroken doctrine of warfare had never once been forced to imagine an enemy building. Conventional doctrine assumes both sides are fighting to win the same war. Devon, the Kryx are fighting a war of conquest. They want our systems intact, our populations pacified, our industry absorbed whole into their machine. We are fighting a war of survival, and a species fighting for survival can afford to do things a species fighting for profit never will. We are going to make sure every system, every asteroid, every colony, every ship in this fleet costs them more than it is worth, until the mathematics of conquering us simply stop making sense to whatever accountant sits behind their war council. That is the entire plan. It was always going to be the entire plan from the day I took this command. We cannot win a fair fight, so there will not be one. She looked up finally, and Auconquorais, who had served under her for 6 years and had watched her authorized decisions that still occasionally visited him in the small hours of ship's night, saw in her face the same flat, terrible calm she had carried through every one of those decisions. Give the order, Devon. Colonial evacuation Directive 7 goes active on my mark. Kestrel's landing burns tonight, and it burns with the Kryx vanguard fleet still sitting in orbit over it. Kestrel's landing was, on the day the order came down, a colony of 190,000 souls clinging to a rocky, wind-scoured world at the outer edge of human space. A mining and agricultural settlement of no particular strategic value, except the one Voss's staff had spent 18 months carefully manufacturing. It sat directly athwart the most efficient transit corridor the Kryx Ascendancy's own logistics computers, fed a carefully constructed trickle of deliberately leaked human sensor data over the preceding year, would calculate as the optimal staging point for a fleet advancing on the Sol Compact's core systems. Every family on Kestrel's landing had been quietly, secretly evacuated over the preceding 4 months. Moved out on unmarked transports in a rolling series of drills, the colonial government told its own people were routine planetary defense exercises. Their homes and workplaces and schools left standing, lights still burn. Zing on automated timers in a colony rendered without its own knowledge into the largest and most elaborate piece of bait in human military history. What remained beneath Kestrel's landing's abandoned streets was 240 kilotons of shaped nuclear charges buried in the colony's mining infrastructure, wired to detonate on remote command, and in the asteroid belt sharing the system's outer reaches, 1,100 more warheads seeded into hollowed rock over 4 backbreaking months of work by engineering crews who had been told, honestly and without euphemism, exactly what they were building and exactly why, and had built it anyway. The Kryx Vanguard, 40 ships under the command of Fleet Commander Resson Thal, arrived at Kestrel's landing 11 days ahead of the main invasion fleet's projected transit, exactly as Voss's staff had calculated, and found precisely what Kryx doctrine expected to find on a colony designated in Ascendancy intelligence files as undefended agricultural settlement, minimal strategic value. An open, unguarded world, a scattering of surface structures showing ordinary civilian activity, no visible defense platforms, no fleet presence, nothing but the quiet hum of a population going about its business, entirely unaware, as far as any Kryx sensor operator could determine, that it sat in the path of an invasion. Resson Thal, a career officer whose own service record included 4 previous colonial pacifications, all conducted according to the Ascendancy's formal codes of honorable conquest, ordered his fleet into standard orbital assembly, transmitted the customary demand for surrender that Kryx tradition required be offered before any occupation began, and settled in to wait the ritual 12 hours for a response he fully expected would be capitulation. He received his answer 9 hours later, not from any colonial government but from Admiral Sarah Voss herself, transmitted on a tight beam that reached his flagship alone, her recorded image flat and unblinking on his bridge display. Fleet Commander, Kestrel's landing has been fully evacuated for 4 months. There is no one left on that world for you to conquer. There is, however, a great deal of buried ordnance, and your entire Vanguard fleet is currently sitting in the precise orbital band our targeting calculations required. I am sorry it has to be this way. I am not sorry enough to stop. The transmission ended, and 1.6 seconds later, 240 kilotons of shaped nuclear charge detonated beneath Kestrel's landing surface in a sequence engineered specifically to hurl a colossal plume of vaporized rock, dust, and shrapnel directly upward into low orbit, into the exact volume of space the Kryx fleet occupied. An artificial debris storm moving at velocities no shield array built to intercept incoming energy weapons had ever been designed to disperse. 11 of Resson Thal's 40 ships were shredded outright by the initial debris wave, their hulls perforated by superheated rock and molten ejecta, traveling faster than any conventional kinetic weapon the Ascendancy had ever modeled defending against. A further 6, attempting emergency high-burn evacuation from the debris cloud, drove directly into the asteroid belt's outer fringe, where Voss's engineers had seeded their second surprise. Proximity-triggered warheads hidden inside ordinary-seeming rock, detonating in a rolling chain reaction that turned 6 more Kryx warships into expanding clouds of debris and vented atmosphere. Crew screaming on channels that Resson Thal's own bridge crew listened to in the specific, paralyzed horror of soldiers who had never once, in 300 years of Ascendancy history, heard an enemy respond to an offer of honorable surrender by detonating an entire evacuated colony beneath their own feet. Resson Thal survived, along with 23 of his original 40 vessels, and fled the system in a retreat so disorganized that Kryx historians would later describe it. In the carefully bloodless language official ascendancy, records reserved for their own catastrophes, as a tactical repositioning necessitated by unanticipated environmental hazard. He did not yet understand that he had just become the first Kryx officer in 300 years to survive an engagement against a species that had chosen, deliberately and with the full knowledge of its own colonial government, to sacrifice an entire evacuated world as a single-use weapon, and that the officer who had made that choice was, at that very moment, already planning the next dozen engagements built on exactly the same terrible, patient logic. Aboard the Iron Harvest, Voss received the confirmation of Kestrel's landing's detonation with the same flat expression she brought to every briefing, and turned immediately to the next phase of the operation, because there was no time in the arithmetic she had built her entire strategy around for anything resembling. NG celebration. 17 of 40 Kryx Vanguard vessels destroyed, 23 withdrawing in disorder, Aconqueres reported, and even his professionally trained voice carried a thin note of something that might have been horror at the scale of what they had just done to a colony that had, until 4 months ago, been home. Casualties among our own evacuation and engineering personnel are being finalized, Admiral. Preliminary estimate is 41 dead in the final withdrawal window, mostly ordnance crews who stayed too long completing the wiring. I know, Voss said, and something in her voice for just a fraction of a second cracked along a fault line that ran deeper than any of her staff had ever been permitted to see. I approved every name on that ordnance crew roster personally, Devon. I read every one of their files. I am not going to pretend this doesn't cost something. It does. It costs exactly what I calculated it would cost, and it bought us 17 destroyed capital-grade Kryx warships for 41 of our own dead, a trade ratio no honest fleet engagement in this war is ever going to give us again. We do not have the luxury of an economy in equilibrium with theirs. We have the luxury of arithmetic, and arithmetic does not care how it feels to use it. She straightened, and the crack sealed itself, or at least sealed itself well enough to keep functioning. Bring up the supply interdiction plan. Kestrel's landing bought us time and blood, but it does not win a war on its own. We start bleeding their logistics tonight. The supply interdiction campaign that followed, conducted over the next 6 weeks by a scattered, irregular fleet of 40 human light cruisers and destroyers operating far outside the Kryx Ascendancy's own border in deep hostile space, was the least glamorous and, by Voss's own private calculation, the single most decisive phase of the entire war, though it would never carry the dramatic weight in later human retellings of the great fleet engagements that followed it. Kryx military doctrine, built across 3 centuries of conquest against species that had never once managed to strike back at anything beyond the immediate battlefield, had never developed a serious defensive posture for its own supply chains, because no enemy had ever survived long enough in any previous campaign to threaten anything beyond the front line of active combat. Voss's raiding squadrons, crewed by volunteers who understood with total clarity that they were being sent on missions with survival odds her own staff privately estimated at under 30%, struck at Kryx fuel convoys, ammunition transports, and unarmed logistics vessels moving between the Ascendancy's forward staging depots and its home industrial worlds. Hit-and-run engagements that rarely destroyed more than a handful of ships at a time, but which, sustained relentlessly across 6 weeks against an enemy with no established doctrine for escorting its own rear-area shipping, began to starve the 600-ship invasion fleet of the fuel, munitions, and spare parts it needed to sustain full-strength operations at the front. The raiding squadrons themselves lived a specific, grinding kind of hell that never made it into the official after-action summaries Voss's staff filed for compact assembly review. Crews spent weeks at a stretch running silent in hostile space, main reactors throttled down to the barest fraction of output required to keep life support functional, sleeping in shifts beside stations they could not safely leave, eating cold rations because the heat signature of a working galley might be the one anomaly a passing Kryx patrol needed to notice. Medical bays aboard the raiding cruisers, built to treat the ordinary bumps and bruises of peacetime service, filled instead with the specific gruesome catalog of injuries that void combat produced. Decompression trauma, the mottled purple bruising of rapid pressure loss across exposed skin, burns from ruptured conduit, the particular deep, disorienting concussive injury of a hull ringing like a struck bell under near-miss weapons fire. Ship surgeons learned, over 6 weeks of raiding, to work fast and without the luxury of full anesthesia stores, because resupply runs back to friendly territory were rare and dangerous. And every raiding vessel that limped home did so carrying wounded who had waited days for treatment that any peacetime hospital would have delivered within the hour. The human ships that ran those raids paid for them in the specific grinding attrition that never made for triumphant headlines. The destroyer Callaway's Ridge, ambushing a Kryx fuel convoy in the debris field of a long-dead system, took return fire from an escort cruiser her intelligence estimates had missed entirely, and limped home 4 days later with her forward hull open to vacuum across 6 decks, 11 of her crew of 90 dead from decompression before damage control could seal. The breach, her captain conducting the remainder of the engagement with blood, his own, floating in slow crimson globes across his command chair from a shrapnel wound he refused to leave the bridge to treat. The light cruiser Meridian's vigil vanished entirely on her 3rd raid. No wreckage ever found, no distress signal ever received. Her 91 crew simply gone into the silence of deep space in the manner that had become, over 6 weeks of raiding, a grimly familiar category of loss that Voss's staff logged with the same flat administrative language they used for every other casualty report, because there was no other way to keep functioning under the weight of what the campaign was costing. By the end of the 6th week, human raiding losses stood at 11 ships destroyed outright and 4 more damaged beyond immediate repair. A toll that Aconquores read aloud to Voss in a voice gone hollow with the specific exhaustion of an officer who had stopped being able to distance himself from the human cost of numbers on a page. And Voss had listened to every word of it without flinching, because flinching, she had long ago decided, was a luxury a commander fighting this particular kind of war could not afford to indulge, not even in private, not even alone. But the campaign worked, in the cold mathematical sense that was the only sense Voss had ever permitted herself to measure success by. Kryx forward supply depots, accustomed to operating with the unhurried confidence of a logistics network that had never once needed to defend itself, began reporting shortfalls in refined fuel and munitions that rippled backward through the Ascendancy's entire war economy, forcing the invasion fleet's quartermasters to divert increasingly scarce resources toward escort duty for convoys that had, until 6 weeks earlier, moved through friendly space without a second thought for their own security. Kaelthorn Vex, still 4 days from the human border when the first reports of Kestrel's landing and the opening raids reached his flagship, read the combined intelligence summary with the first genuine flicker of something other than confidence he had felt since assuming command of the Second Ascendant Fleet. A flicker he identified, with the clinical honesty he prized in himself, as unease. They destroyed an entire colony, he said to his own chief of staff, Fleet Second Ressa Vale, turning the summary over on the plot table between them with the careful, deliberate motion of a man trying to make an unfamiliar shape fit into a familiar box. Their own colony, 190,000 of their own people evacuated, their homes wired with enough ordnance to gut a fleet, and they detonated it without hesitation the instant our vanguard sat in the right orbital band. Ressa. In 300 years, has any species we have ever conquered done such a thing to its own territory? No, High Speaker, Ressa said, and there was in her voice the same careful discipline Kaelthorn recognized in himself. The discipline of an officer trying not to let unease curdle into something closer to fear before the data justified it. Our records show no precedent. Every previous campaign, every species we have brought into the Ascendancy has fought to preserve what it built, has treated its own colonies as things worth protecting rather than expending. This is She hesitated, searching for a word the Ascendancy's own military vocabulary, built across 3 centuries of honorable, ritualized warfare, did not readily supply. This is not how war is conducted, High Speaker. No, Kaelthorn agreed quietly. It is not how war is conducted by anyone we have ever fought before. I begin to wonder, Ressa, whether that is precisely the point. He pressed forward anyway, because 300 years of unbroken ascendancy doctrine did not permit a commander to abandon a campaign over a single, if disturbing, engagement, and because the mathematics of the war on paper still favored the Kryx overwhelmingly. 600 ships minus the 17 lost at Kestrel's landing against 200 human vessels that Ascendancy intelligence continued even now to rate as technologically inferior in every meaningful category. The main invasion fleet crossed into human space 11 days later, and the war that followed over the ensuing 4 months became, in the memory of every human and Kryx officer who survived it, a grinding, brutal, mutually devastating campaign that bore almost no resemblance to the swift, decisive conquests the Ascendancy's 3-century history had trained its commanders to expect. Voss's fleet did not attempt to hold any single line, did not commit its full remaining strength to any pitched battle. Kaelthorn's superior numbers could simply crush through concentration of force. Instead, human forces fought a war of continuous exhausting attrition across a dozen systems simultaneously, trading territory for time and time for Kryx Ascendancy in a pattern that Voss's own staff, in the privacy of the Iron Harvest's flag bridge, referred to with grim, exhausted humor as the Long Bleed. Colonies fell one after another to Kryx occupation forces, and each one without exception had been quietly, brutally prepared in advance. Automated defense grids that fought to the last drone and then self-destructed rather than surrender intact hardware. Orbital infrastructure rigged, as Kestrel's landing had been rigged, with hidden ordnance that detonated the moment Kryx occupation forces reached critical mass in orbit. Industrial facilities whose evacuating human engineers sabotaged every piece of equipment beyond salvage rather than leave it functional for Kryx use. Kaelthorn's fleet took every world it fought for, exactly as 300 years of doctrine promised it would, and found in every single case that the world it had taken was worth a fraction of what it had cost to seize. A hollowed, booby-trapped shell rather than the intact, productive conquest his doctrine had always delivered before. The human ships themselves, meanwhile, fought with a specific, terrible willingness to spend themselves that had no precedent in any conflict the Ascendancy's officer corps had studied. The doctrine Voss had drilled into her surviving fleet across 18 months of preparation, a doctrine her own staff had come, in the grim shorthand of wartime slang, to call the Hammerfall Protocol, called for obsolete human destroyers, ships too old and too poorly armed to survive sustained engagement against Kryx capital ships in any conventional exchange of fire, to be stripped of everything not essential to propulsion and structural integrity. Their crews reduced to skeleton complements of volunteers, and driven at maximum burn directly into the heart of advancing Kryx formations as pure kinetic weapons. Tens of thousands of tons of steel and reactor mass converted, on impact, into a release of kinetic energy that no shield array, however sophisticated, could meaningfully disperse. Selection for the volunteer crews that flew those final missions was, by design, a brutal and unsentimental process. Candidates were required to have no dependent family remaining in occupied or threatened territory, to pass a psychological screening designed less to weed out the unstable than to confirm, with total clarity, that every volunteer understood exactly what they were agreeing to, and to sign, in the presence of a chaplain and a legal officer both, a document that Voss herself had insisted be worded without a single euphemism. This crew member understands that this assignment carries an expected survival rate of 0% for those who remain aboard through final approach, and volunteers for it regardless. Thousands applied. Voss's staff selected the crews with the same cold arithmetic that governed every other decision of the campaign, prioritizing technical proficiency over sentiment. Because a ship driven into a collision course needed steady hands at her helm and her reactor controls until the very last possible second, and there was no room in that calculation for anything but competence. The destroyer Josiah Hale, 41 years old and scheduled for decommissioning before the war began, was one of 11 ships committed to this doctrine during the Battle of the Coraline Reach. Her crew of 14, reduced from a peacetime complement of 90 specifically, because Voss's staff had calculated exactly how few souls were required to keep her structurally functional through her final burn, riding her reactor to a deliberate overload. Her hull glowing white-hot with radiant heat bleed as she closed the last 100 kilometers to the Kryx cruiser Sovereign's Grace. And the impact, when it came, converted both ships into a single expanding cloud of molten wreckage and vaporized crew in a detonation that briefly outshone the system's own sun. The final 90 seconds of the Josiah Hale's approach, recorded by her own bridge cameras and later reviewed in exhaustive, harrowing detail by Voss's own staff as part of the doctrine's after-action refinement, showed a crew working through their final checklist with a steadiness that no training simulation had ever been able to reliably produce. Voices flat and professional over the intercom even as the hull temperature readout climbed past every threshold any peacetime safety protocol would have called catastrophic, until the helmsman's final transmission, 3 seconds before impact, consisted of nothing more than a course confirmation and half a second later, a single word that the ship's recorder captured but that Voss ordered stricken from every public account of the battle, because she judged rightly. That the dead had earned the right to have their last private moment remain private. 12 of the Josiah Hale's 14 crew evacuated in the final 90 seconds before impact, in escape pods launched on trajectories calculated to carry them clear of the collision's blast radius. 2 did not, staying at their posts to hold the reactor's overload sequence stable through the final critical seconds, and their names, Petty Officer 2nd Class Miriam Oduya and Reactor Technician 1st Class Tomas Ferreira, were read aloud at every subsequent fleet memorial service for the remainder of the war. The first 2 names on a list that would, by the war's end, run to several thousand. Kaelthorn Vex watched the destruction of the Sovereign's Grace and 10 other capital ships across the Battle of the Coraline Reach's opening hours, with a horror that his own Ascendancy officer corps had no established vocabulary to properly articulate, because nothing in 300 years of honorable Kryx warfare had ever prepared a fleet commander to watch an enemy deliberately convert its own obsolete warships, crewed by volunteers who understood with total clarity that they were sailing to their own destruction, into weapons whose entire purpose was self-annihilation. "They are ramming us," he said to Ressa Vale, watching the tactical plot redraw itself in real time as a second human destroyer. The Callaway's Pride drove itself at maximum burn into the flank of the dreadnought vessel of steadfast purpose, the resulting collision gutting the Kryx ship's engineering section and killing over 400 crew in the initial impact alone. Ressa, they are deliberately destroying their own ships, their own crews, in order to destroy ours. This is not desperation. Desperation is what a losing commander does in the final moments of a battle he knows he cannot win. This is planned. This is doctrine. They built this into their strategy from the very beginning of the war. "High Speaker," Ressa said, and her voice, for the first time in Kaelthorn's long service alongside her, carried an unmistakable note of something that was not quite fear but stood very close to it. "Our own casualty projections for this engagement assumed conventional exchange rates based on comparative technological capability. We are losing capital ships at a rate our doctrine has never accounted for, to an enemy fielding vessels our intelligence rated as decades obsolete. If this pattern continues across the remainder of the campaign, it will continue," Kaelthorn said, with the particular flat certainty of a man who had, in the space of a single battle, begun to genuinely understand the shape of the enemy he was fighting. "It will continue because the humans commanding this war have made a calculation we have never once been forced to make in 300 years of conquest, Ressa. They have calculated that they can afford to lose everything, Every ship, every colony, every crew, so long as the cost of taking it from them exceeds what the Ascendancy is willing to pay. And I begin to fear, watching this, that there is no floor to what they are willing to lose in service of that calculation. A species that will detonate its own evacuated colony beneath an enemy fleet, that will crew its own obsolete warships with volunteers and fly them to deliberate destruction, is a species that has already decided the war is a mathematics problem rather than a contest of honor, and mathematics, Ressa, does not care how much it costs to prove a point, only whether the equation ultimately balances in the solver's favor. The war ground on across 4 brutal months in that pattern, battle after battle in which Kryx's numerical and technological superiority delivered, in the narrow tactical sense, exactly the outcomes 3 centuries of doctrine promised: world seized, human fleets forced to withdraw territory ceded system by system toward the Sol Compact's core, while the broader strategic arithmetic Voss had built her entire campaign around ground inexorably in the opposite direction. Every world the Kryx took cost more in ships and crew than the doctrine's historical conquest had ever required. Every supply convoy that failed to arrive at the front deepened a logistics crisis that Ascendancy war economists back on the Kryx homeworld had begun, in increasingly urgent internal reports that human signals intelligence intercepted and relayed directly to Voss's staff, to describe in language that bordered on panic. The Ascendancy's client worlds, which had for 3 centuries funded the war machine's endless expansion in exchange for the stability and protection Kryx conquest historically provided, began receiving news of the campaign's mounting cost through channels the Ascendancy's own propaganda apparatus could not fully suppress, and the first cracks of genuine political dissent in 300 years of imperial cohesion began, slowly and then with gathering speed, to spread through territories that had never before had reason to question whether continued loyalty to the Ascendancy was worth its price. Human losses across the same 4 months were, by any honest accounting, catastrophic in their own right, and Voss never once permitted herself or her staff the comfort of pretending otherwise, insisting that every casualty report cross her desk personally rather than be summarized by a subordinate, because she had decided on the first day of the war that a commander who authorized this scale of sacrifice owed the dead at least the discipline of reading every name. The Sol Defense Fleet that had begun the war with 200 ships stood, by the close of the 4th month, at 61 hulls still combat-capable, the remainder destroyed in the grinding sequence of Hammerfall strikes, supply raids, and conventional engagements that the long bleed strategy required. Colony populations across the 17 worlds that fell to Kryx occupation had, wherever evacuation proved possible, been relocated to the Sol Compact's inner systems in a refugee crisis that strained human civilian infrastructure to a degree that Voss's own government back on Earth debated, in increasingly heated closed-session hearings, whether the strategic cost of her doctrine could be sustained for the length of time victory appeared to require. Relief agencies struggled to house and feed populations numbering in the millions, families who had lost not only their homes but in many cases, every physical possession beyond what could be carried aboard a departing evacuation transport, and the political cost of that suffering, broadcast nightly across every inhabited world in the Compact, weighed on Voss with a specific, personal heaviness that she never once allowed to alter the calculations driving her strategy. However much it altered the private hours she spent alone with those same calculations after every briefing ended. Voss herself, by the 4th month, had not slept more than 4 hours in any single stretch since the war began, sustained on a combination of stimulant medication and the particular grim discipline of an officer who had decided, long before the first shot was fired, that her own physical and psychological endurance was simply one more resource to be spent as ruthlessly as any ship or colony in service of the arithmetic she had built her entire strategy around. Admiral Sarah found her on the Iron Harvest flag bridge in the ship's small hours, watching a casualty summary she had already read 4 times, and the exhaustion in his own voice after 4 months of the war he had helped her plan, had settled into something closer to permanent residence than temporary fatigue. Central Command is asking again whether we can sustain the current loss rate through to the projected collapse point in their supply economy. Political pressure from the Compact Assembly is mounting. Colony governors are demanding to know why their worlds were sacrificed while others were held. I don't have a good answer for them, Admiral, and I don't think you do either. I have the only answer that matters, Voss said, not looking up from the summary. The Kryx supply interdiction campaign has cut their forward fleet's operational tempo by an estimated 40% over the last 6 weeks, according to signals intelligence pulled from 3 separate intercepted logistics reports. Their client worlds are beginning to question the cost of continued loyalty for the first time in 300 years of Ascendancy history. Their fleet commander has requested reinforcement from the Ascendancy homeworld twice in the last month. Requests that Ascendancy High Command has, according to the same intercepts, declined both times, citing budgetary and political constraints they have never once faced before this campaign. We are winning, Devon. We are winning in the only sense that has ever mattered to this strategy. We are making the war cost more than the war is worth to the people who started it. I understand exactly what that victory has cost, and I understand exactly what it is going to continue to cost until it is finished. I do not have the luxury of being comforted by that understanding, and neither, I am afraid, do you. Draft a response to the Assembly. Tell them the truth. Tell them the strategy is working exactly as designed, and that the alternative to what we are doing is a war we lose in 6 weeks instead of winning in 6 months, at a cost that would make everything we have already paid look like a bargain by comparison. The final phase of the campaign, the engagement that would come to be known across the whole of the Sol Compact simply as the reckoning at Icarus Deep, unfolded across the outer debris field of a long-dead binary system. Voss's staff had spent the entire preceding 4 months quietly, patiently preparing as the trap into which the entire remaining strength of both fleets would ultimately be drawn. Kaelthorn Vex, his second Ascendant fleet reduced by 4 months of grinding attrition to 380 ships, and his own war council back on the Kryx homeworld increasingly desperate for a decisive engagement. And that would end the campaign's mounting cost before political pressure from the Ascendancies. Client worlds forced an unprecedented negotiated withdrawal, committed his entire remaining strength to a single, concentrated strike aimed at destroying what his intelligence identified, correctly, as the last major concentration of human capital ships remaining in the war. Voss, whose own intelligence had spent weeks carefully feeding the Ascendancy's own signals, intercepts exactly the picture of vulnerability that would draw Kaelthorn's fleet into precisely that position, met him there with her own remaining 59 ships, and the final, most brutal piece of preparation her staff had spent the entire war quietly assembling. The Icarus Deep debris field itself, seeded across its entire volume with over 4,000 hidden nuclear mines, proximity-triggered munitions disguised among the ordinary drifting rock and ice of a dead system, waiting for a fleet large enough and confident enough to commit fully to the field's interior before the trap closed. The battle that followed was, by any measure either side would later apply to it, the single most destructive engagement of the entire war, and it cost both fleets more than either had expected to survive. Kaelthorn's advancing formation, 380 ships pressing into the debris field in pursuit of a human fleet that appeared, by every sensor reading his tactical staff could gather, to be retreating in genuine disorder, triggered the first waves of hidden mines roughly 40 minutes into the engagement. A rolling, cascading series of detonations that tore through his formation's outer screen and center mass alike. Indiscriminate in a way that no conventional weapon in 300 years of Ascendancy warfare had ever needed to be, because the mines did not care whether a Kryx ship was a lightly armed escort or the flagship vessel of righteous correction itself, only whether it crossed the invisible geometry of a detonation, radius calculated months in advance by human engineers who had never once expected to see the specific ships that would eventually trigger their work. The detonations themselves came in a pattern that Kryx damage control crews, trained across 3 centuries to expect the ordered sequential threat of a conventional beam-and missile engagement, had no framework to process. A first ship gone in a silent flash at the edge of formation, then a second and third simultaneously somewhere in the center mass, the debris field itself becoming, within minutes, a churning storm of secondary shrapnel and superheated plasma that made every subsequent maneuver a gamble against threats no sensor suite could fully map in real time. Ships attempting evasive burn found themselves driving directly into fresh minefields, their own tactical computers, overwhelmed by the sheer density of contradictory proximity warnings, failed to flag in time. Aboard the cruiser vessel of distant sky, a single detonation amidships collapsed 2 full decks in on themselves, crushing crew where they stood at their stations, while the ship's remaining structure, its spine cracked but not yet severed, continued drifting through the debris field trailing atmosphere and the frozen, tumbling shapes of crew who had been thrown clear of the hull breach into the vacuum, a sight that surviving Kryx officers aboard nearby vessels would describe in reports filed weeks later. As the first time in their careers, they had witnessed the specific, silent horror of void death at close visual range, rather than as an abstraction on a casualty report. Kaelthorn's own flagship took catastrophic damage in the second wave of detonations, her shields collapsing under the cumulative force of 6 separate proximity blasts, her forward third venting atmosphere and crew alike into the freezing dark, and Kaelthorn himself, thrown from his command chair by the force of the impact, watched his own bridge crew die around him in the specific, gruesome reality of void combat that no Ascendancy training simulation had ever fully prepared him for. Decompression injuries, flash-frozen blood crystallizing in the sudden vacuum before emergency bulkheads sealed, the particular silent horror of watching subordinates he had commanded for years asphyxiate in the seconds before pressure doors closed around them, sealing the wounded and the dying alike on the wrong side of survival. Human losses in the same engagement were nearly as total. Of the 59 ships Voss committed to the trap, only 22 survived the battle's opening 90 minutes, the remainder destroyed either by the same mine detonations their own engineers had planted, triggered when Kryx point-offense fire disrupted the carefully calculated retreat vectors human ships needed to clear the blast radii in time, or by the desperate, furious return fire of a Kryx fleet that, even mortally wounded, still possessed enough raw firepower to gut a human cruiser in a single concentrated volley. The cruiser Meridian's Watch, Voss's own former flagship before she transferred her flag to the Iron Harvest 3 months earlier for reasons of tactical flexibility, took a full broadside from the dreadnought vessel of steadfast purpose in the battle's 43rd minute, and came apart along her spine in a slow, terrible unraveling that her surviving crew watched happen around them in real time, bulkhead by bulkhead, deck by deck. 311 souls lost in a span of under 2 minutes. Their final transmissions a chaos of damage control reports, and, in the last handful of seconds before the ship's structural integrity failed entirely, simple, human voices calling out names of people they would not see again. Voss received the consolidated casualty report from Icarus deep 4 hours after the battle's conclusion, in the same flat combat lighting of the Iron Harvest flag bridge where she had received every other report of this war. And for the first time in 4 months of command, Conquerez watched her read it in complete silence for nearly a full minute before speaking, her hands, he noticed, gripping the edge of the plot table with a pressure that had gone white at the knuckles. 37 of 59 committed vessels destroyed, she said finally, and her voice, for the first time since the war began, carried something that was not quite a crack but stood very close to the edge of one. Approximately 4,100 crew lost across the engagement. Kryx losses, by our best estimate from wreckage analysis and intercepted distress traffic, exceed 310 ships of the 380 committed, with casualties likely in excess of 100,000, though we may never have an exact figure. She set the report down, And for a moment, just a moment, Conquest saw something pass across her face that looked, for the first time in 4 months, less like an admiral executing a strategy and more like a human being counting the cost of what that strategy had actually required. We won, Devon. In every sense that matters to the war we are fighting, we won decisively at Icarus Deep. I would like, just this once, for someone in this fleet to acknowledge out loud that winning this war has been one of the most horrifying things any of us will ever be part of, and that I do not expect any of us to feel good about it, today or on any day that follows. No, Admiral, Conquest said quietly. I don't imagine any of us wills. Kaelthorn Vex survived the reckoning at Icarus Deep, aboard a crippled flagship limping clear of the debris field with barely 40% of her crew still living, escorted by the 17 ships that remained of a second Ascendant fleet that had crossed into human space 4 months earlier 600 strong, and in the days that followed, confined to a medical bay aboard his own dying ship, while engineers fought to keep her structurally intact long enough to reach a friendly system. He found himself returning, again and again, to the same question that had first surfaced in his mind, watching the destruction of the Sovereign's grace at the Battle of the Coraline Reach 4 months earlier. A question that had grown, engagement by engagement, from professional curiosity into something considerably closer to existential dread. It was not, he understood now with total clarity, a question of whether the humans could be defeated in any single battle. A fleet with sufficient numerical and technological advantage could likely still grind down the remnants of Sol compact resistance. Given enough time and enough willingness to absorb further losses on a scale, the Ascendancy's political structure back home had already made unmistakably clear it would not tolerate for much longer. The question that mattered, the question that kept him from sleep in the sterile quiet of a medical bay surrounded by the moans of wounded crew and the low mechanical hum of life support struggling to keep a broken ship livable, was a considerably more frightening one. What precisely was the floor beneath what this species was willing to do to avoid conquest? And had the Ascendancy in 4 months of war actually found it or merely glimpsed the outer edge of something considerably deeper? He requested, once the flagship reached a Kryx forward base for emergency repair, a full formal review of every recorded human tactic across the war's entire 4-month span, and spent 3 sleepless nights compiling it into a single document that he transmitted, along with his own personal assessment, directly to the Ascendancy's High Council rather than routing it through the ordinary chain of military reporting, because he understood with a clarity that felt almost like physical pain that what he had to say could not wait for the ordinary bureaucratic pace of Ascendancy governance. The humans, his report noted, had detonated an NT. Re-evacuated colony beneath an advancing fleet without hesitation. They had crewed obsolete warships with volunteers and flown them to deliberate, plan destruction as kinetic weapons, a tactic his report described in language he knew would unsettle the Council precisely as much as it had unsettled him, as the deliberate institutionalization of self-sacrifice as standing military doctrine. They had seeded an entire dead star system with thousands of hidden nuclear mines months in advance of any engagement that might use them, a scale of pre-planned, patient ruthlessness that implied, and this was the conclusion Kaelthorn's report dwelt on longest, a species entirely willing to render any territory it could not hold permanently uninhabitable rather than surrender it intact to conquest. And they had done all of this, his report emphasized, not out of desperation in the final collapsing moments of a lost war, but as calculated forward-plan doctrine conceived and prepared before the war's first shot was ever fired, by a command structure that had evidently decided from the very outset that total war without limit was preferable to conquest. If we continue this campaign, Kaelthorn's report concluded, in language he drafted and redrafted a dozen times before finally transmitting it, because he understood exactly how unprecedented it was for any Ascendancy commander to write such a thing after any single defeat. We are not fighting a war against a numerically and technologically inferior adversary that we will eventually grind down through weight of resources. As our doctrine has always correctly calculated against every previous enemy in 300 years of expansion. We are fighting a species that has demonstrated repeatedly and consistently a willingness to destroy anything, including its own colonies, its own ships, its own crews, and by clear extension its own homeworld should the war ever reach that final extremity, rather than accept defeat. I do not believe there is a floor to what this species will sacrifice to avoid conquest, and I no longer believe the Ascendancy's client worlds, whose loyalty is already fracturing under the economic strain of a campaign that has cost us 3/4 of the fleet we committed, will sustain the political will required to test how far that floor actually extends. I recommend, in the strongest terms available to me after 30 years of honorable service to the Ascendancy, that the High Council pursue immediate negotiated withdrawal from human space, on whatever terms the human command is willing to offer before we discover, at a cost none of us can currently calculate, precisely how much further this species is prepared to go. The Ascendancy's High Council, faced with a report from one of its most decorated fleet commanders that directly contradicted 300 years of doctrine holding that no enemy should ever be granted terms, debated the question for 11 days before authorizing Kaelthorn, still recovering aboard his crippled flagship, to open formal negotiations with the Sol Defense Fleet's command, and it was Kaelthorn himself, rather than any more senior Ascendancy diplomat, who requested the honor of conducting those negotiations personally, because he understood, better than anyone else in the Ascendancy's entire command structure, exactly what he needed to say to the woman who had spent 4 months teaching him the true shape of the war he had walked into so confidently. He met Admiral Sarah Voss aboard a neutral transport vessel at the edge of the Icarus Deep debris field 6 weeks after the battle that had broken his fleet, both of them flanked by small honor guards that neither side expected to need. The conference compartment lit by the same cold, distant starlight that had watched 380 Kryx ships and 37 human vessels die within sight of the very viewport beside which the two commanders now sat. Kaelthorn had spent the transit rehearsing, in the careful, methodical way his 30 years of Ascendancy service had trained into him, precisely what he intended to say, and had discarded every version of it somewhere over the last several hours, because none of the formal diplomatic language available to him, language built across 3 centuries of accepting the surrender of others, carried any precedent for what he now had to do himself. Standing across a conference table from the human commander whose strategy had cost his own species 3/4 of the fleet it had committed to a single campaign, he found himself, for the first time in 30 years of Ascendancy service, genuinely uncertain of the proper protocol for the moment. "High Speaker," Voss said, and her voice, Kaelthorn noted, carried none of the triumph he might have expected from a commander who had just won a war against overwhelming odds. Only the same flat, exhausted clarity that had characterized every recorded transmission of hers high. This own intelligence staff had studied throughout the campaign. "I understand you're here to discuss terms." "I am here," Kaelthorn said, and found the words, when they finally came, carried a weight he had not fully anticipated until he was speaking them aloud. "To surrender the Ascendancy's claim to human space, Admiral, and to be entirely honest with you about the reason, because I believe you have earned that honesty more than any adversary I have faced in 30 years of service. I am not surrendering because your fleet defeated mine at Icarus Deep, though it did decisively. I am surrendering because I have spent 4 months watching your species demonstrate over and over a willingness to burn everything you have, your colonies, your ships, your own people, rather than accept our conquest, and I no longer believe there is any point at which that willingness would stop, short of the complete destruction of everything either of our civilizations has built. I do not know what the floor of your ruthlessness actually is, Admiral. I am no longer willing to find out, and I do not believe my own government, faced with what continuing this war would ultimately cost, is willing to find out either. We have fought 300 years of honorable wars against species that fought to preserve what they built. We have never before fought a species willing to destroy everything, including itself, to deny us victory. and I confess to you without shame that this terrifies me considerably more than any weapon your engineers have built." Voss was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, there was something in her voice that Kaelthorn, studying her face across the conference table with the careful attention of a man trying to understand an adversary he had never truly comprehended until this exact moment, recognized as genuine, weary honesty rather than any calculated diplomatic posture. "We didn't want this war, High Speaker. We didn't choose to become a species that detonates its own colonies and flies its own ships into deliberate destruction. We became that because you gave us no other option that led anywhere but conquest, and my job, from the moment your fleet crossed into our space, was to make sure that whatever it cost us to survive, it cost you considerably more to try to take us. I am not proud of everything this war required. I will carry every name on every casualty list for the rest of my life, and I suspect you understand now exactly what that weight feels like. But I would do all of it again, exactly as we did it, because the alternative was a species that no longer exists to have this conversation with you at all. If your council wants peace, High Speaker, we will take it, and I will not pretend I'm not relieved to be sitting across a table negotiating terms instead of standing on a bridge watching another fleet burn. But I want you to carry one thing back to your council clearly, so there is never any confusion about it in whatever history your people write of this war. We did not win because we had better ships or better weapons or a clever trick your intelligence failed to anticipate. We won because we were willing to pay a price you were never willing to match. And if this war ever resumes on any terms, we will be willing to pay it again." The formal treaty ending the Kryx Ascendancy's invasion of human space was signed 11 weeks later, its terms considerably more favorable to the Sol Compact than any human diplomat had privately expected the Ascendancy to accept. And in the years that followed, as the treaty held and the shattered remnants of both fleets slowly rebuilt in their respective territories, the war came to be remembered very differently on each side of the border it had drawn. Within the Kryx Ascendancy, the campaign was studied in exhaustive and uncomfortable detail as the single event in 300 years of imperial history that had forced a fundamental revision of Ascendancy military doctrine. A revision built around a new and deeply unwelcome category of threat that Ascendancy war colleges came to classify, in language that filtered slowly outward to every client world under Kryx authority. As an adversary willing to exceed any rational calculation of cost in pursuit of survival, a designation that Ascendancy strategists learned, in the decades that followed, to treat with a caution no previous conquest had ever required. Kaelthorn Vex himself, invited by the High Council to lecture at the Ascendancy's principal war academy on the campaign that had ended his career as a field commander, spent the remaining years of his service teaching a new generation of Kryx officers a lesson that sat uneasily alongside 3 centuries of doctrine built on the assumption of honorable, rational adversaries. That a species need not be technologically superior, nor even numerically comparable to defeat an empire, provided it was willing to accept a scale of self-inflicted cost that no honor code the Ascendancy had ever developed could match, and that the only reliable defense against such an adversary was never to give it cause to consider total war a preferable alternative to negotiation in the first place. Within the Sol Compact, the war was remembered with considerably less clean satisfaction, honored in memorials that listed thousands of names across dozens of worlds, studied by historians who never fully resolved the moral weight of a strategy that had won through a ruthlessness few humans, even those who benefited from its success, were entirely comfortable claiming as their own legacy. The rebuilt Sol defense fleet that rose in the years following the treaty carried, quietly and without official acknowledgement, the doctrinal fingerprints of everything Voss's campaign had proven necessary. Contingency plans for colonial evacuation and demolition kept permanently current rather than dusted off only in crisis. A standing volunteer reserve trained and equipped for missions that no peacetime officer ever wanted to discuss openly. a fleet doctrine that assumed, as a baseline planning principle rather than a last resort, that survival might one day again require costs no honorable adversary would expect a civilized species to be willing to pay. Few of the sailors who served in that rebuilt fleet ever met Sarah Voss personally, but every one of them, in the years that followed, trained under officers who had, and who carried forward in ways both spoken and unspoken, the same flat, unflinching arithmetic she had brought to the darkest 4 months of human history. Admiral Sarah Voss retired 18 months after the treaty's signing, declining every honor the Compact Assembly attempted to bestow on her, and spent the remaining years of her life declining, with the same flat consistency she had brought to every wartime decision, to describe the war as a victory worth celebrating, telling the one journalist who eventually pressed her hard enough to answer that the only honest thing she had ever learned from 4 months of total war was that humanity had discovered, in the crucible of near annihilation, exactly how far it was willing to go to survive, and that she hoped, with a sincerity that surprised even her own staff, that no future generation would ever again be forced to learn precisely how far that was.